talk about World War, like, the thing about 1944 onwards, from the perspective of World War II, like from 1943 onwards, like the whole war was purely political. Because you see, I'm gonna set the stage for you guys. You see, the Allies, Britain, France. France was basically kind of like a. They weren't even really part. Like they were the Allies. They were allied with Britain, but from 1942 onwards. I mean, 1941 is when. No, 1940 is when the French was defeated. But from 1940, I say from 1940, late 1940-ish, the French were no longer really part of the equation in terms of like the hegemony of the world order, and who was the most powerful, and the hierarchy of power. Like they were not on that level because Britain was still intact. Their navy was still intact, mostly. They still had most of their overseas empire intact too. India was still going strong. They still had Egypt, North Africa. They still controlled North Africa. But the French, they're only like helpful. Yeah, but they also had a clause. After I'm kind of running all over the place, jumping from space to space, but the French did have a clause. Like after they lost the Battle of France to Germany, and the French signed the armistice in 1940, one of the clauses in that contract, because the treaty is still a contract, right? But one of the clauses in the contract was that the French would not attack the Germans with their navy that was in North Africa. They had a big navy in North Africa, and they had a big foothold in North Africa as well. They had Tunisia, they had all the way up to Libya. Libya was part of Italy's governance, and Egypt was part of Britain. Now, what I'm trying to say is, from 1943 onwards, it was clear that the Germans were going to lose the war in World War II. They were done. There was no way they were going to win the war, because after Stalingrad, which was, I would say, Stalingrad was the turning point. I don't know. It's kind of hard to say. Like, what was the turning point in World War II? Like, was it after the counterattack at Moscow in 1941, after Operation Typhoon? Was it Operation Typhoon? Like, was that when it was the turning point? Because when the Germans attacked Moscow, they had a very good foothold, but they were overextended. They were massively overextended, and then the Soviets brought in their troops from Siberia to kind of counterattack, and they drove the Germans back a lot. Then the Germans counterattacked and regrouped because the Soviets had overextended themselves because their supply lines were too far away, blah, 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 like all these reasons. I think that was when that was the turning point, because the German army was bled white in 1941. 1942, the second counteroffensive, when they were trying to attack the Caucasus oil fields, was economic. But that was kind of like, that was not the same kind of attack that they had in 1941 with an Operation Barbarossa. Case Blue compared to Operation Barbarossa, it's a big difference. Operation Barbarossa is over here, and Case Blue is over here in terms of strength, power, like how much resources were allocated to that task. I would say Operation Barbarossa was a lot more complicated and a lot more powerful than the Operation Case Blue, because that one was more like what were the Germans trying to do? They were attacking from the Dnieper, right? Not Dnieper, but from what do you call that place? Near the Caucasus. They were attacking from that point. They wanted to take the Caucasus oil fields, and Stalingrad was basically like the buffer between the Soviets in the north and the east, right? Because if they could keep Stalingrad, that means that they can shield any attack from the north or the east from the Soviets, and then they would be able to take the entire Caucasus, because Stalingrad was also a pipeline to go to the Caucasus, so that they would be able to transport oil to Moscow. But that's besides the point. I'm kind of rambling all over the place. Yeah. Rostov on Don. That's what I was looking for. That city right there. That's where they wanted to take it. They took Rostov on Don. They were successful, and then from Rostov on Don they attacked Stalingrad. But kind of going all over the place again. But I truly believe that from 1943 onwards, it was basically a matter of time until the Allies won the war. From 1942, maybe the Germans kind of had a chance, but I don't think they did. You know, if you look at it from every sense of the term, like there was no way the Germans could ever have won the Battle of Stalingrad. It's just not possible. They were already massively overextended. They were at the end of their supply lines. They were already stretched thin on other areas of their front. The Italians were under-equipped. The Romanians were under-equipped. There was vast holes in their lines. Like there was just nothing they could have done to kind of maybe they could have like there's nothing they could have done. They were already massively overextended. They just didn't have the resources to go that far in enemy territory. And it's actually a miracle that they got that far to Stalingrad. That they actually reached Stalingrad was a feat in itself. But I say all this to say that the Germans never had a chance to begin with against the Soviet Union, even though they had massive success early on. But that was mostly because of the upheaval that Stalin did in the Great Terror of 1930s, you know, when he took over and killed like thousands and thousands of officers. Just it was a purge, basically, like to kind of it was a political purge to kind of get rid of like all of the people that he felt were like a threat to his rule. And he weakened the army because of that, and that's why the Germans had such success early on. But if he had allowed them to actually pull back their troops when the Germans were encircling them, then they may have like saved a lot of lives. But later on, Stalin started to like listen to his generals more, and Hitler was the opposite. He started to kind of move away from his generals' line of thinking, and he kind of went towards what he wanted. And then Stalin was the opposite. He would kind of listen to his generals more. So that's kind of like the personality difference between both leaders. And even then, if you look at it from that perspective and you say, okay, what if Hitler did listen to his generals? Even in that situation, he still would have lost because he's fighting Britain, he's fighting France, he's fighting the United States, he's fighting Russia. Like, they were never going to be able to beat the combined power of the United States, Russia, Britain, France. Like, it's just not like the fact that they stood out that long was a miracle in of itself. Yeah, I mean, the line of thinking is perhaps that they could have beat the Russians, and then once they took the Soviet Union, and then they were able to absorb the economic might of the Soviet Union, then they perhaps could have created like such a self-sustaining nation to where they would be able to be powerful enough to take over and to then attack Great Britain and then use Great Britain as a launch pad to attack the United States. But you know, that's just not realistic. You know, they were already running low on resources, and the only reason Operation Barbarossa was even possible was because of the French. They captured lots of French equipment, tanks, jeeps. Like most of the German army was pretty much all like horse drawn. Like all of their ammunition, all of their fuel, all of these different things, they were not a fully mechanized force. They were mostly horse drawn. Yeah, ponies and horses and stuff like that. Yeah, exactly. Some of them, I mean, they were partially mechanized, but not even 50%. The French helped them get mechanized a lot more, but you know, there was, yeah, and then it was purely political from 1943 onwards because what was that meeting that they had at what was it called? They convened, and then they talked about how they felt that the second world, like all of the world powers convened and came together in this 1945 there was another one, but 1943 I think they had one where they what was his name, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, right? They were the three world leaders that were they were the three most powerful people on the planet outside of Hitler's power was waning every day. But yeah, they were Hitler was at his best, like most power at 1942. That's when the territory of the Nazi Germany was at its peak. But it was illusionary, like an illusion mostly, because their success wasn't necessarily that good. Because the Soviets were pulling back most of their forces, most of them were not getting encircled. From 1942 onwards, the Soviets were doing a lot better. And then from 1943 onwards, after the Kursk battle, it was all downhill from there. Yeah, I'm trying to remember what that was called. Like that meeting that they had. It was somewhere in North Africa. Because, yes, I'm also failing to mention the North African theater of war. 1943, the Italians, they capitulated. And North Africa was basically the Americans invaded and they took over. They took over North Africa and they allied themselves with the Vichy France. And then they convened at I don't remember what it was called. I don't remember. You guys can write it in the comment section. When all three world leaders convened in 1943, they decided on a plan of action for the war. They made a plan. They said, the Allies, they committed to a plan of D-Day, the D-Day attack, like invading France and liberating France and the Low Countries, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And then to attack Germany and help the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was right now the only person that was actually attacking and fighting the Germans man for man. They were the ones that was actually matching them in intensity. I think a lot of people don't realize how much of an accomplishment the Soviets had, how much of a role the Soviets had in defeating the Nazis. They were more pivotal than anyone. If you look at the three world leaders, Britain, well, let's take away France. France wasn't really part of the equation. They weren't there at that conference in 1943, right? So let's take away France. So Britain, how much did they do? Well, they did the least out of the three. If you compare all three, America was definitely second because they provided the bulk of the resources. The Russians provided the bulk of the men and they were the ones that drove the Nazis out of the most territory, and they suffered the most in terms of in the hands of the Nazis during the invasion of Operation Barbarossa. So, it's kind of like a little what do you call it? A little talk. I kind of wanted to do this, man, bro. I really gotta look at Operation Bagration, that fucking battle, that. The fact that Rokossovsky actually pulled that off was amazing. It was a logistical feat, fucking brilliant operation, because what they managed to do was absolutely destroy Army Group Center, liberate, I think they took back all of Belarus, most of Western Ukraine. They took Baltic states to, dude, most of Army Group Center was cut off and destroyed, and then after that enabled them to create the Kolan pocket and destroy most of Army Group North, but they couldn't destroy them completely, so they just sent some troops there to kind of contain them there. So like Stalingrad, a little what do you call it, encirclement. There's a fun fact here for you guys. One of the generals, I believe it was the guy that likes tanks. What's his name? Guderian. I believe it was Guderian that told Hitler, "Oh man, come on, we gotta evacuate the Kolan pocket and send them back so that we can use them to defend from the second offensive that the Russians were mounting after they created the Kolan pocket." Now, then they focused on the Baltic states, and then they focused on the East Prussia, to take East Prussia and the Baltic states, and then take over Hungary, Romania, and all those other cities, so that they can attack towards Germany. Yeah, you have to obviously attack those countries that are close to Germany, so that you can create a base to invade because your supply lines are too far away. You know, it's just how it works, stuff like that. Because if your supply lines are too far away, it's kind of impractical to attack from such a like because then you're gonna run out of steam at some point because your tanks need fuel, you know your trucks need fuel. But besides the point, that's I'm just trying to say like 1943 onwards, like it was purely politics. Like who could grab the most amount of land before the war ends so that they have the most leverage in a peace deal, right? Because after World War II ended, another war started, which was not really a hot war. It was a cold war because it wasn't a war of direct confrontation. It was a war of espionage, a war of an arms race, a war of espionage, spying. There was an arms race. Yeah, stuff like that. Stuff like that. Yeah, it's like an iron curtain. So my point is that I've said all this to say that the alliance that they had was purely of mutual interest. Why? Because after World War II, the mutual interest they had was defeating Nazi Germany. Once they accomplished that goal, what then? They did discuss that in those conferences in 1943 at the trifecta. No, it's not trifecta. It's Treblinka. Treblinka? No, that's a fucking prison camp in fucking. That's a fucking it's a fucking penal colony in Russia, dude. No. It's Tripoli. No, that's the capital of Libya. I don't know. I don't know. Someone can tell me in the comment section, but an alliance of mutual interest. Yeah, that was my point. Like, they were never friends, bro. Like, they didn't give a fuck about each other. They only had to destroy Nazi Germany because they felt that they were the Russians were the lesser of two evils in a way. Yeah, because they weren't committing wholesale genocide. Well, that's debatable because Stalin was killing millions of people and doing all this crazy shit. So, but he was less evil than Hitler, right? That's the premise that we're looking at here. That's probably why why did they ally with the Soviets instead of the Nazis? Like, why did they? Well, the answer's clearly there for you, bro. Like, it's obvious why. Because, well, actually, Hitler wanted a peace deal with Britain in 1940 after he defeated France. Yeah, because he wanted to be free to attack Russia without any interference from Britain. Because they were basically a thorn in the side of Germany.